Is it possible that Game of Thrones is back in a very real way? Are people even open to giving it a chance? Let's discuss. Before I get started, I'd like to kindly ask that you hit the like button and please subscribe to the channel for more content just like this.
You have the luxury of not knowing what I know.
Game of Thrones, the once proud franchise that was almost universally loved at one time or another. I know when Game of Thrones was at its peak, I was convinced that it was one of, if not the greatest, television series of all time. And then that much maligned, rushed final season happened, and even though I tried to find the best that I could in it at the time, deep down I always knew that it was below the standards that the previous seasons had set.
That's right, it stinks!
And we had two people to thank for that being showrunners Benioff and Weiss. Not HBO, who wanted more episodes and more seasons, and not George R.R. Martin, who wanted something similar. It was because of these two guys, Benioff and Weiss, who seemingly just wanted to get the series over with so they could move on to other things. Most notably, a Star Wars trilogy that will probably never happen now. I wouldn't necessarily say that the ending of Game of Thrones ruined the entire series for me. With companies like Disney now owning and producing content for some of my favorite properties, I've become very good at ignoring subpar entertainment while still being able to appreciate what came before. And that's pretty much the approach I take with Game of Thrones. So when a new Game of Thrones series was announced that would focus on the reign of the Targaryens, I was admittedly a little skeptical, and I wasn't entirely sure that the demand for more Game of Thrones content would still be there, especially after the overwhelmingly negative reaction to the finale of the original series.
You blew it!
The one thing that gave me hope going into this series was that one, George R.R. Martin did give it his seal of approval, and for the most part it seems like they are trying to stick to the source material. I'm no expert on the source material, so don't quote me on that, but I know Benioff and Weiss's biggest problems came after they tried to make the show without a book to work off of. So now that I've seen the first episode of the new series House of Dragons, what do I think? I gotta be honest with you, for the most part it felt like I was watching something closer to the old Game of Thrones episodes than I was the mediocre final season.
Get the fuck out of here! No, I cannot, it's serious!
Early on, it felt like the new showrunners are trying to remind people of what Game of Thrones used to be, and I can appreciate that. The show begins with a power struggle already in progress for the coveted Iron Throne. And again, this is an idea that we are all accustomed to seeing if you're familiar with Game of Thrones. As long as that struggle doesn't end with the most random person possible, Bran Stark, we might get a more fitting finale this time out.
Anybody care about what I want?
I do.
Shut up. Get out.
At the beginning of the show, Viserys Targaryen is chosen to be the new king over his female cousin because, let's just face it, that's how things worked back then. There's already an element to this show where characters are showing resistance to the idea of a female sitting on the Iron Throne. Now, in any other situation and in any other show, they might turn this into a social political statement. And don't get me wrong, there's still time for them to ruin this idea and do just that. But it's all on how it's presented to us.
Something very familiar about all this.
And given what we know about the world of Game of Thrones, this is a very natural inclusion to this story. And so far, after just one episode, I didn't notice anything annoying or preachy about it. Although I'm sure the Twitter crowd will turn it into just that. This episode started to show you all the little behind-the-scenes chess moves that we've become accustomed to seeing in Game of Thrones. We have a king who is desperate to have a male heir. We have his wife who is pregnant but isn't sure if it is a male.
Get me a blonde-haired white boy so I can enjoy that shit!
We have his daughter who gives off Daenerys vibes, and she wants to be considered as heir even though yes, she is a woman. And then we have the king's brother Daemon, who is a standout of this episode in my opinion. He's kind of the wild card here. He's irrational, he's emotional, and he's kind of driven by his own selfish ambitions. And every time he seems to get just a little bit of power, he abuses it. There's one brutal scene in this episode where he has all of his men dish out a little justice around King's Landing that results in some beheadings and some dicks getting chopped off, because why not?
Yes, it's true. This man has no dick.
And they're clearly trying to show you what kind of ruler Daemon might be, and it looks very similar to something like Joffrey. His highly emotional and somewhat sensitive personality is what ultimately eliminates him from consideration to being the new heir. There's been a lot of talk about one scene in particular in this episode that was honestly pretty dark. It's where King Viserys chooses to have his unborn child cut from his wife's stomach while she's still alive. And they pretty much show it in all of its grisly detail.
What the hell am I looking at?
Some people are taking issue with this scene. I just think it's pretty much par for the course as it pertains to Game of Thrones. It's a very brutal and tragic world, and we are very accustomed to seeing things like that happen, especially when things like lineage are the most important to these people. He was that desperate for a living male heir that he was willing to sacrifice his wife's life.
Cancel that bitch.
But in a cruel twist of fate, that doesn't work out for him anyway, because the boy ends up dying as well. His brother Daemon declares the boy heir for a day during a drunken speech that he has. And Hand of the King Otto Hightower reports this information back to the king, and of course this makes him not very pleased with his brother. And it ultimately seems like he's pretty much banishing him at that point, although I'm sure this is not the last time we will see him. You see, because the Hand of the King is playing his own game. First to remove Daemon from the equation, and then he sends his own daughter to comfort the king when his wife and child dies.
A what?
I assume in an effort to get her knocked up next, and then he has an in forever. Foul motherfuckers doing foul shit. That's pretty much the MO for Game of Thrones. And again, all of this just felt very familiar and what we are accustomed to seeing, and it didn't feel like they were pulling any punches here. After this, Viserys pretty much has no choice but to name his daughter official heir to the throne. And this decision, of course, rubs a lot of people the wrong way.
A fucking woman boss? Never happened in the States.
Most notably, the head of House Baratheon, who shows a bit of hesitation before pledging his allegiance to her. And anyone who knows the significance of that hesitation can appreciate its inclusion here. Overall, I have to say I wasn't blown away by House of Dragons, but at this point I am willing to give it a chance at the very least. This episode played out like a single family drama, but I am interested to see how this all plays out and how complicated things get when inevitably more and more people try to make their play for the throne. I wouldn't say that this show is as polished as OG Game of Thrones, but it does have a lot of qualities that remind me of it.
No shit.
I think what's most interesting about this show and the beauty of it is that we know where it's going. We know that this reign leads to the Mad King and ultimately to the fall of the House of Targaryen. But this gives us an opportunity to see the family at their peak. It's something that we've only heard legends told about, and now we get to see it in real time. Because sometimes to truly appreciate the fall, you have to see what led you to it. And you can already see some dysfunction in a Targaryen-led kingdom. I just think that there's lots of potential here. It's just up to the new showrunners to follow through and not overtly ruin a potentially good thing for a second time.
Y'all be cool. Nah.